Welcome to MMT Mondays on Real Progressives. My name is Jeff Ginter. I'm your host. So we've been talking a lot about the need to get economic experts into the forefront. It is our job as activists to be able to wake people up to what is possible, to get people to understand, to put it bluntly, how they've been screwed, how they've been fucked, how they've been shafted for 40 years, being told over and over and over again that real good things for the country, for the people, are just not possible. We just can't afford it. And it's our job to wake people up. And one of the things that entails is getting people to get to the source of this information. It's one thing to listen to me. It's another thing entirely to listen to Stephen Hale, who we're going to be listening to tonight. One of the reasons I love to put forward Stephen Hale is because he is an excellent example, not only of a great communicator of MMT and what it is and what the possibilities really are, but he's also an excellent example of someone who used to be a neoclassical economist, someone who was trained in neoclassical economists. He went to school specifically so that he could find out how the world worked, so he could do things that would benefit the world, that would benefit society. That was his point. That was his purpose. And what he got in exchange was a neoclassical education on economics that reinforces the idea of scarcity, that we don't have enough. And it means everything when you understand that they're not talking about we don't have enough stuff. They're not saying we don't have enough resources to do X, Y, and Z progressive policy. They're saying we don't have enough money. It's simply not affordable. And he went along with it by his own admission, to his own stated shame. This is what he bought into because that's what he was taught. That's all he was taught. And eventually, even the people that he was teaching, as bankers, he was responsible for educating future bankers. And every now and again, as he'll explain, someone would come up to him and say, it can't really work this way. And several conversations later, and then we get the 2008 financial crisis. And suddenly he is starting to realize that something is just wrong, and he does his research. He puts in the work, the hard work, the long work of being able to figure out exactly how does the economy work? How did the great financial crash happen? Why wasn't it good for the United States to run a surplus in the late 90s? Why was that bad? Everyone thought it was great, but then we had the great financial crash. What is going on? So I love Stephen Hale, a perfect example of someone who used to be, on the side of neoclassical, realized that everything that he had learned, everything that he was putting forth himself, was clearly wrong. And instead of covering that up, instead of deciding to further his own personal career by shoveling shit, he decided that he was going to get back to his roots. Why did he want to go into economics in the first place? To make the world a better place. And you can't do that with neoclassical economists. You can't do that with a set of principles that says, sorry, there's just nothing we can do. Meanwhile, they're getting rich. So I love Stephen Hale. I love him for the way that he communicates. I love the story of Stephen Hale. And I hope you will too. We'll be back in a little bit. Bye-bye.
I was asked initially whether I'd talk about the job guarantee. But first of all, you've got Bill Mitchell coming along next time to talk to you. And having me talk about the job guarantee when you've got Bill Mitchell coming from Newcastle, in a sense, is people used to say taking coals to Newcastle. In England, that would be taking coals to Newcastle. Plus, I've already done a couple of talks about job guarantees in Melbourne, and one or two people in the room here have heard that already. My job is actually talking about money and finance and all that. I'm a lecturer in economics at Adelaide Uni, where I've been now for about 17 years. In the 1990s, and I'm sad to say, even in the late 1980s, just because it ages me a bit, I used to train bankers, please don't hate me for this, in London, including from the Bank of England. And that's basically why, or how, when we decided to move to Adelaide, just because I loved Australia and wanted to come and live here, and I loved Melbourne, but being a Londoner, spending 35 years in a big city, I wanted to try living in a small town rather than a big city. That's why I live in Adelaide, and that's how I ended up teaching money and banking courses at Adelaide Uni. I've only been a modern monetary theorist partly because of the influence of Bill Mitchell, who's coming along to talk to you next time, for somewhere between 10 and 15 years. So if I contrast our way of looking at the world with what is still, in Australia anyway, the mainstream way of looking at the world, the neoclassical way of looking at the world, I'm almost contrasting the way I see the world now with the way I would have seen it 20 years ago. And if some of the things that I'm going to say, if you're relatively new to MMT, seem at all surprising or confronting, then I like to say that's okay by me. It's great if you're sceptical, because that was exactly my reaction. I started to get interested in modern monetary theory in about 2004. I wouldn't say that I started describing myself as a modern monetary theorist until just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which was towards the end of 2008. It took a long while and a lot of reading and research. Some of this story and a description of what modern monetary theory involves and the way we do macroeconomics, something called stock flow consistent macroeconomics, and how it fits in with behavioural economics and work by psychologists, and an attempt to justify and describe how a job guarantee would work and how we think economies ought to be run, is in this book, which is ridiculously overpriced, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend you buying a copy. I'm not I don't get paid extra money when they sell these, but if you'd like to take a look at a chapter from the book, the chapter on modern monetary theory, for free, then you can send me an email, maybe via the organisers of today's talk, and I'll send it to you to take a look at. And somebody is going to get this copy that I brought with me today anyway. Has anybody heard of Stephanie Kelton? Yes, some of you have. The two most famous modern monetary theorists are Bill Mitchell, who's coming to see you soon, and probably the only one who around the world, amongst the general public anyway, might be more famous than Bill, is Stephanie. Stephanie came over to Australia last year, sponsored by Get Up for the purpose, and she did a talk in Melbourne. Was anyone there? I think it was in the town hall, yeah. She did a talk in Sydney. I went to the one in Sydney, and she did a talk in Brisbane. Stephanie is Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor and was the chief economist on the Democrat side on the Senate Budget Committee a few years ago. She has a great deal of influence, including amongst people who normally only listen to mainstream economists. And it's great that the University of Adelaide have made her our visiting Harcourt professor for the next year. She'll be in Adelaide in January. And so many people want to see Stephanie that rather than arranging meetings with her and all of them and flying all over the place, because she's only around for about a week when she comes over, I'm organising a conference which will be aimed at politicians and activists and the general public, as well as at economists too, but it's not principally aimed at economists. And Stephanie will be speaking. Warren Mosler, you might also have heard of, who along with Bill invented MMT. He won't be there in person, but he'll be giving a talk as part of the event. We have a whole stream of other speakers in case you feel like coming along. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Reserve Bank and the government and the federal debt and all that kind of stuff, but I thought there might be one or two people here who've hardly ever heard of modern monetary theory before or are new to it. So I thought we'd better have a little bit of a refresher. Who's the guy on the left-hand side? Does anyone know? Minsky. That's right, Hyman Minsky. Modern monetary theory is built on the shoulders of a previous generation of economists, most important amongst those, two people called Abba Lerner and Wynne Godley, and also Hyman Minsky. Most of the American modern monetary theorists were students or colleagues of Minsky.
He's popular.
Yeah. Minsky's become popular since the global financial crisis. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to be aware of how famous Hyman Minsky has become. Every economist has heard of Hyman Minsky now. In Minsky's most famous book, which was published in 1986 called Stabilizing an Unstable Economy, he included this quote: "The game of policy making is rigged. The prince is constrained by the theory of his intellectuals." I don't believe that the progressive side of politics in Australia, and you could say this in most countries, have ever properly understood how the monetary system works. Even in the days when there were fixed exchange rates, it's a different story now. But it's certainly the case now that the Labour Party and the Greens and progressives generally around the world are fighting often with one arm behind their back because they don't understand the monetary system, because they listen to economists. If you follow Bill's blog, you'll have come across this a little bit in the context of the Labour Party in the UK, who are themselves from the neoclassical mainstream, who present them with options that constrain their choices. They're not aware they have more freedom for good or ill than they imagine. And that's why I've included this quote from Warren Mosler too. Lack of understanding of the monetary system has been the worst enemy of the progressive agenda. Modern money basics. I wrote a couple of years ago an article for the Conversation site where I said that modern monetary theory could be boiled down to two axioms and one identity. An axiom, using that word correctly, is a statement which is obviously true, which you shouldn't even have to justify or test because it's just obviously the case. And I used to put the second one before the first one on this list, but I've noticed down through the months that actually it's more effective to reverse them. If you start off by saying a monetary sovereign government, we'll worry what a monetary sovereign government is in a moment, a currency issuing government like ours, faces no purely financial constraints, then you get that emotional reaction from people. They misinterpret what you're saying. They think you're saying that the government should spend without limit. Of course, you're not saying that at all. All economies face real constraints. What do we mean by that? In every society, there's a limited supply of labour and skills and capital equipment and technology and infrastructure and natural resources and ecological space, limiting our productive capacity. And if we spend beyond that productive capacity, then it's going to cause a problem in terms of accelerating inflation. We accept that. Modern monetary theory does not dismiss the problem of inflation. In fact, in some ways, we think we take it more seriously than mainstream economists do. MMT is not a recipe for limitless spending. It's not even necessarily, in all countries, a recipe for a higher level of public spending than there is at the moment. Well, that first statement is obviously correct. It's an axiom. Well, so is the second one. If you are the monopoly issuer of Australian dollars, you cannot run out of Australian dollars. Everybody from Bill Mitchell to Alan Greenspan, the former follower of Ayn Rand and chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, would agree, as far as that's concerned. So those two statements are obviously correct. The third statement is an identity. That means it's a mathematical equation which is true by definition. In this case, you can justify it from the national income accounts, or you can justify it just from saying for every lender in the financial system there is by definition a borrower. If you need to borrow, if you're spending over this year, let's say, more than you're earning and you're borrowing to cover the difference, then an economist might call you a deficit unit. You're running a financial deficit. If I'm spending less than I'm earning and I'm adding to my savings, then I'm a surplus unit. I'm running a financial surplus. Across our entire financial system in Australia, for every surplus unit, there's a deficit unit. For every dollar that is being lent, there's a dollar that's being borrowed. We can aggregate. We can aggregate all households. If we were aggregating all households and I'm a surplus unit and you're a deficit unit, we'd cancel out as far as the aggregate is concerned. We can aggregate across the whole private sector, which includes households and businesses, including financial institutions as well. If we do that, so that we've got an aggregate balance for the private sector, there are two other sectors too. There's the government sector and there's the rest of the world. We sometimes call the rest of the world the foreign sector. The same thing applies. Across those three sectors, they cannot all be running surpluses. If the rest of the world is running a surplus with Australia, which means we have what's called a current account deficit on our balance of payments, which we've had since 1974 and we still have at the moment, despite the trade surplus. That means the rest of the world is running a surplus on our financial system. If the government over the next year is also running a surplus on our financial system, what does that mean about the private sector? It means it must be running a deficit because the surpluses and deficits have to cancel out, because for every lender there is a borrower. This is not a theory, this is just a fact. It would be a theory if you started to try and tell a story about causation, that changes in one balance were driving changes in the others. But in terms of just being a statement, it's just an accounting result. It's something that has to be true. What our government is betting on is that our economy will not implode over the next year or two. While the government runs a surplus, it's extremely unlikely that the foreign sector is going to go permanently into deficit in the near future in Australia. So they're betting on the private sector being in deficit. It's extremely unlikely, given the state of our economy, that there's going to be an investment boom as far as businesses are concerned. So they're betting on households going further into deficit. That means they're betting on the ratio of household debt to gross domestic product, which in our country is about 125% of GDP at the moment, household debt. They're betting on that rising again. Well, we already have the world's second highest household debt ratio. I don't think that's going to happen. And people like me were saying this a year and a half ago too, when all those mainstream economists, you might have read them, in the newspapers were saying, oh, be careful, interest rates are going to go up in Australia. It's just a matter of time. Interest rates have to rise soon. I could name some financial journalists, but I won't, who were saying that. We were saying that's not going to happen in the near future. Our economy is going to be quite weak. We have so much household debt at the moment. If the government insists on trying to push its budget towards surplus, well, any surplus is going to be very temporary because the economy is going to slow down and potentially go into recession, and the tax receipts won't be as strong as they're forecasting. They'll be, and the government will end up with a deficit anyway. Well, all that sort of logic and those broadly defined forecasts come basically from understanding the basics of modern monetary theory, which are simple enough. To quote another person that we built on, John Maynard Keynes, in the general theory, the ideas which are here expressed so laboriously, because actually there's a lot of slides, I won't go through them all with you, otherwise we'll be here all day. They're quite simple. Monetary sovereign governments. What is a monetary sovereign government? To be a monetary sovereign government, you have to issue your own currency. Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, they are not monetary sovereign governments. Don't imagine that you can draw any lessons from any of those countries and the way those governments have had to manage their budgets over time and the debt crisis they've been engaged in. You can't draw any lessons from them and apply them to Australia, a completely different case. Monetary sovereign governments issue their own currencies, use a floating exchange rate. So when you're talking about foreign countries that have a fixed exchange rate, well, they've limited their sovereignty by doing that, because if you have a fixed exchange rate, you are guaranteeing that you will convert your own currency into foreign currency at a fixed rate to defend the value of your currency while you remain with that fixed rate system in place. And of course you can run out of foreign currency, so don't compare countries like Argentina or Venezuela, for that matter, with Australia and our monetary system. They have nothing in common with our monetary system. And those countries tend to have significant foreign currency debts too. Our government has no significant foreign currency debt. We have had a floating exchange rate since 1983, and of course, we're a currency issuer. Australia is a monetary sovereign government. The US has a monetary sovereign government, so does the UK, so does Canada, so does Japan, so does New Zealand, so do a stream of other countries that we could list. They are currency issuers and full monetary sovereigns. Everybody else, you and me, the small businesses near where you live, BHP, the state government of Victoria, the government of Greece, they're all currency users. Well, if you're a currency user, if you're going to spend, you've got to earn the money before you can spend, or else you have to run down past savings to pay for your spending, or else you have to borrow before you can spend. And when I talk about the net money supply, I'm talking about the total indebtedness of our federal government, basically. So, how are you going to fund your surplus? That's the issue. Deficits are self-financing. What do I mean by that? Every time the government spends, they create dollars. When they tax, they destroy dollars. If they spend more than they tax, the number of dollars goes up. That's what happens. It's self-financing. Those dollars, as I'm going to tell you about before we finish, if I don't spend too long talking about this kind of stuff, for reasons to do with interest rate management, are converted into Treasury bonds. In other words, the Australian Office of Financial Management, the Treasury, basically regularly auctions Treasury bonds to absorb those dollars that have been created by this government net spending, because it helps the RBA to manage interest rates. That's why they do it, not because they need the dollars. Why would they need the dollars? They create the dollars. On the other hand, federal surpluses don't pay for themselves. When people talk about the problem of funding the federal deficit, they've got it 180 degrees the wrong way round. The problem is in funding surpluses. Surpluses tend to drive economies into recession. Paul Keating managed to have a surplus just before the big recession in the early 1990s. Of course, John Howard had a surplus. We didn't have a recession. What they managed to do was deregulate the financial system, lend to households and treble the amount of household debt. We've not dealt with that problem yet. It's the hanging around the neck of the economy and dragging it backwards at the moment. Federal surpluses must be funded either by the rest of the world deficit spending. If you're Germany and you're running a huge current account surplus, if you're Singapore or Norway running a huge current account surplus, sure, then you can have your government running a surplus and your private sector running a surplus, because it's the rest of the world that's borrowing on your financial system. That's what's happening as far as you're concerned. That's not the case for Australia. Here are Australia's financial balances as a percentage of our GDP, direct from the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, since the late 1980s. Now, that line across the top, that's the foreign sector balance. If you changed it from a plus to a minus, it would be our current account deficit. It's been between about 2% of GDP and about 7% of GDP ever since 1974. It's about 2% now because our trade surplus is quite strong. The current account includes payments of interest, profits, dividends, and one or two other things too. And basically, Australia's current account is not in surplus even now. It's been reasonably stable over time. If you're worried about the country having a big deficit with the rest of the world, as I suppose you might be, although with a floating exchange rate it's not exactly a problem, that happened when John Howard was Prime Minister. That happened when there was a federal surplus. If people tell you a federal deficit necessarily means a bigger current account deficit, not in Australia, not in the last 40 years anyway. Quite the opposite, if anything. What you can see here, well, let's get rid of the rest of the world. We'll just have the government balance and the private balance. You see, when the rest of the world was there, the three of them on average would come out to zero. That was the point of including all three balances. Since the foreign balance has been a plus the whole time, if we just look at our Federal government balance and private sector balance. Well, you can see this is what economists would describe pretty clearly, not just economists, anybody that had done first-year statistics. There's something of a negative correlation there going back over recent decades, isn't there? When everybody gets really pessimistic because there's a global financial crisis, even if Australia doesn't have a nasty recession, then the private sector rapidly goes from being in huge deficit to surplus because everybody wants to save and nobody wants to borrow anymore and the banks don't want to lend anyway. Of course, the government balance goes into deficit. About half of that was Kevin Rudd deliberately running a deficit to support the economy. The other half was our automatic fiscal stabilisers, just tax receipts crashing because the economy stopped growing at the time. What's the point of this graph? The point of this graph is this is what they're forecasting at the moment. Not just the government, but in the recent election, the opposition too. In fact, they were promising to do it even more. When Chris Bowen was the shadow treasurer before the election, he was saying, yes, we're going to run a surplus, we're going to pay down the debt. He should have said, we're going to destroy some money. That's what it means. But he didn't say that because he didn't understand. It's not his fault, it's his advisors. But anyway, they talked about running a bigger surplus than the coalition was promising to run. And that's what the coalition is promising. They're promising to push us above that line. What that means is they're promising to push the private sector further into deficit. I don't think we're going to have a business investment boom. I don't think it's businesses that will be doing the deficit spending if this happens. They'll need to find some way of getting the private sector to deficit spend and not businesses, and that means households. So how will we fund their fiscal surplus? You're going to have to borrow more to make it happen, otherwise it won't happen. I don't think it will happen for very long. What happened last time we did this? Well, this is what happened last time we did this. The Howard Costello government managed to run years of budget surpluses, and part of that was the mining companies borrowing a lot to dig big holes in the ground. That investment boom's finished now. But much of it was households borrowing huge amounts, and that's one of the reasons why it's so expensive to buy any housing in places like Sydney and Melbourne, and why the property market in those two big cities, this city, is so dicey these days. It's that enormous build-up in household debt. Only Switzerland is above us. Only Switzerland is above us as far as household debt is concerned. So what they're gambling on at the moment is that somehow they can get that red line going up again. What people like me and Steve Keen and other people who know much more about these things than I do are saying is we just don't believe that will happen. So we don't think the economy is going to grow very quickly. And in fact, there are signs of it not happening already. The amount of new lending has been decelerating over the last year, just as the property bubble has. It's not burst or anything, but it's deflated somewhat for the last year and a half. We don't think it's going to happen. So I think, well, they might get 1 year of surplus, but it's quite likely we're going to get a recession in Australia in the next year or two, unless they change their tune. All right. Now, we could just stop there for a moment, because that's sort of part one. That was me going over MMT and why I think MMT is useful. And if you understand what we've been talking about so far, I forecast, if this is not true of you already, that you'll find it very difficult to watch Q&A. It's very difficult to watch the whole programme, because at some point in the middle, somebody talks about paying down the debt. And you just think, no, not at the moment. Or if anybody was to mention what I was just talking about, somebody would say, Zimbabwe, hyperinflation, spending without limit. That's not what we said, is it? Nobody wants to spend without limit. We're just saying if it is appropriate to do some more deficit spending, given the state of the economy and private sector balance sheets, and trying to get households to borrow a bit less and have the government do a bit more deficit spending, the government isn't going to run out of dollars. That's what we're saying. Anyway, does anyone want to ask anything now, or shall I go on? Go on.
Why don't you think we will borrow more?
Why don't I think we'll borrow more? Because most of the people I know have got as much debt as they can easily manage already. Go on.
In the previous graph, you showed over the space of maybe 5 years the whole offloading of to that the private debt. If it's household debt and property loans, how is that happening so quickly? Private balance.
How is, well, this is gross debt. This is not just the private, this is not just households, this is the whole private sector, and this is not gross debt. So there's not a simple relationship between the two.
Is that flow and the other one's stock?
This is the stock of household debt. It's also gross household debt as well. So the household sector could have a zero balance, but you could still see gross household debt rising over time. And particularly in a country where the degree of inequality was increasing, this might happen, because you might expect people who are well off through superannuation, etc., to be adding to their saving, running surpluses. Other people could be running deficits, borrowing more. Those people borrowing more would increase gross household debt. But actually, if I had got the household balance on here, you could have a household balance of zero. So there's not a simple... so yes, this is a flow and the other one is a stock, but also there are other reasons why there's not a simple relationship between the two. I'm just pointing out that actually if you were to say when the fiscal balance started to tighten up in 1994 until 2009 when we went back into deficit, I don't think it's a coincidence that that's 1994 and that's 2009. There is a relationship between the two. If you get James Juniper to come and talk to you about stock flow consistent macroeconomic models, he'll show you some equations and charts and things and explain the relationship. But that's not something that I want to try and do right now. Go on.
Steve, I've heard Bill talk about writing off debt. Yeah, I think it's writing off debt. Why couldn't the American government simply write off $20 billion of debt and start again?
They could do that if they wanted to. Whose debt?
There's mainly American
private sector debt.
Private sector debt.
They could do that, yeah. They could take the debt on their own balance sheet. I don't expect them to do that in the US. I do expect that to happen in China at some point. I don't think there's going to be a terrible catastrophic crash in China, because I don't think that the Chinese government plays by the same rules that we do. And a lot of the debt in China is held by state-owned companies anyway. And it would be quite easy, actually, for President Xi just to write it off, to add the debt to the, if you like, to the Chinese central government balance sheet. They're not going to run out of yuan. That's not that they don't have problems to do with all sorts of issues, including demographic ones. But the Chinese government isn't going to run out of yuan any more than the Australian government will run out of dollars. Anyway, maybe I might just go on a bit. Back to Hyman Minsky. I've been talking about the Australian government being a currency issuer, and I've sometimes used the word money. I've said when the government spends, it creates money. Well, absolutely. And when the government taxes, it destroys money. That's actually literally true. Banks, private banks can create money by lending. They can't create what we're going to call currency. There's a distinction there. There are different types of money. Government money and private sector money are not the same thing. Hyman Minsky, a long time ago, said, well, in principle, anyone can create money. If you perform some service for me, and if I give you an IOU, saying that I'll pay you $1,000, and if I'm well known and have good credit in our community, then that $1,000 IOU I've given you, somebody else might take that from you in return for goods and services, and it could start trading as money. Anyone can create money. The problem lies if we're talking about money as being a generally accepted medium of exchange, being accepted in the community generally in exchange for goods and services. The problem lies in getting it accepted. Well, your deposit with your bank is part of your bank's debts. It's an IOU your bank has to you. When your bank lends to you, if they give you a deposit at the bank on which you can draw, which is what sometimes happens, when banks lend to you. Actually, you are exchanging IOUs. The bank has a financial claim on you. You promise to pay the bank back over time with interest. You have a financial claim on the bank. You've got a deposit at the bank. If you want to spend out of that deposit, if it involves a transfer of funds into somebody else's account at a different bank, well, your bank has promised to arrange that for you, and they'll arrange that for you using the government money that they hold at the RBA. If you want government money yourself in the form of physical currency, well, your bank's promised to give it to you. If you're going to use your bank account to pay your taxes, to discharge your liability to the government, well, actually your bank will do that for you. There's no way of you directly doing it. It's your bank using its holding of what we call its exchange settlement account, its holding of government money at the RBA. Because our deposits at our banks, we are confident that we can convert them into the currency which our government and the RBA issues at par, dollar for dollar. And there's no risk of that not being the case. Because of that, we accept the funds that we've got on deposit at our banks as having value in exchange, as being money, as being a monetary asset. But in a sense, it's a little bit similar to the story I told you a minute ago, where I had a debt to you and I had a good credit rating, you had reason to trust my IOU. Anyway, that's what Hyman Minsky had to say about money. Over here we have John Maynard Keynes. Now, I'm going to be arguing, before we finish, if I go very quickly, that we shouldn't be thinking of government debt as debt at all in a country with a monetary system like Australia. And it always helps to have someone like Keynes to quote here, so I've taken a footnote from the general theory slightly out of context. What Hyman Minsky's just said, basically, over here, is that all money is debt, but not all debt is accepted as money. Over here, well, if all money is debt, then we can draw the line between what we regard as money and what we regard as debt, perhaps at whatever point is most convenient for handling a particular problem. A 5-year term deposit you have with your bank is included in the money supply in Australia, in the broad measure of the money supply anyway. A 5-year government bond is at least as safe, if not safer. Very similar asset, actually. More liquid, in fact. You can more easily get the cash back before maturity because there's a very liquid secondary market for treasury bonds. Why don't we think of treasury bonds as being money rather than debt in the conventional sense at all? Why might it make sense to do that? It might make sense to do that because it would change the discourse. It wouldn't change anything that really mattered fundamentally, but it would change the discourse. Nobody'd talk about the possibility of the government running out of money. Barnaby Joyce did this on Q&A a few years ago. He started going on about we might have to fire all the school teachers and all the nurses because the government's going to run out of money if we keep going on like this. Nobody contradicted him, really, on the panel. Somebody tried to contradict him from the audience, but it's nonsense to talk like that. Anyway, how does our monetary system work? We've got the Treasury over here, and the Reserve Bank, which is owned by the Treasury. And if we're thinking about the people on the board of the Reserve Bank who make the interest rate decision on the cash rate every month, they're appointed by the Treasury. 3 of them are ex officio. One of those 3 people is the Treasury Secretary, is the chief public servant in the Treasury, who's on the RBA board. Then there's the governor and the deputy governor that the government appoint, and then they appoint another 6 people for terms of 5 years, but they're appointed by the government. Yes, they make interest rate decisions. They have done since the early 90s, in a sense independently of the government, but they're pursuing an inflation target which was negotiated between the government and the RBA. They operate under the terms of the RBA Act, which of course is laid down by politicians. Basically, the Reserve Bank has only a very, very limited degree of independence from the government and is best thought of as part of the government. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than this because the Treasury thinks it can save money sometimes by having some of the government's transactional accounts, some of the agencies that make up the governments having transactional accounts with private banks. But that's just a complication that we won't worry about. For the most part, the federal government banks at the RBA. The official public account, or more correctly, the official public accounts group, is managed by the Reserve Bank of Australia. It's just a bookkeeping item, if you like. Sure, the government has a balance at the RBA, but it's not included in any official measure of the money supply, and it could be anything really. Until 1982, the RBA regularly bought and held on to treasury bonds that the government issued. The government still has, although they don't use it very much, but the government still has an overdraft facility at the RBA. The RBA and senior officials of the RBA have regularly, when we've asked them, said there are never any circumstances where they'd ever bounce a cheque of their owners, which is what the Australian government is. And by the way, to the extent that the RBA does own government securities, sure, the government pays interest on them from the official public account. That interest then becomes officially part of the RBA's profit, and then it's paid back to the official public account again in a dividend. That's how it works. It's all really complicated when you start talking about it, but it's all smoke and mirrors. Who else banks with the RBA? A lot of foreign central banks do, and one or two other weird and wonderful institutions we won't worry about, but basically our banks and authorised deposit-taking institutions, they have things called exchange settlement accounts. They have exchange settlement account balances at the Reserve Bank of Australia. We have one monetary aggregate which is called the monetary base, which doesn't include very much. It's got about $115 billion in it at the moment. It includes the physical currency that you and I carry around with us. There's about $75 billion of that in the economy right now. And there's another 40 billion or so, which is the exchange settlement account balances of banks and other authorised deposit-taking institutions in Australia. That's the monetary base. That's government money, if you like. That is what's been spent into existence by the Treasury or lent into existence by the Reserve Bank of Australia. That is the currency which it is necessary for the private sector to have to pay its taxes. Money is that which is necessary to pay your taxes. Taxes are paid using those exchange settlement account balances. You think you're paying your taxes to the government. In fact, your bank is paying your taxes using its exchange settlement account balance. Your deposit goes down, so the bank, your bank's liability goes down, but the bank's exchange settlement account balance goes down as well, so the bank's assets go down by the same amount. Those exchange settlement account balances are also used for, all of us to make payments, and for the sake of this diagram, the state governments are over here with the rest of us in the private sector. They don't bank. There are some state government balances which are not important at the RBA, but state governments basically do not bank with the Reserve Bank of Australia. The government of Victoria banks mainly with Westpac, for example, but the different state governments have different arrangements in terms of their banking, just like the rest of us do. And, if you want to make a payment to the government of Victoria, maybe you've got to make a tax payment to the state government. Well, technically what's happening is that your bank's exchange settlement account balance is being debited by that tax payment. And in this case, Westpac has its exchange settlement account balance credited. That's how it works. Millions of transactions taking place over time. We could, again, get very complicated because we are in the middle, literally in the middle of a transition in Australia from retail transactions, like I was just describing, being batched and cleared irregularly over time. It used to happen once a day, more recently 5 times a day. We're in the middle of a transition to real-time gross settlement, even for retail transactions, which we didn't really until recent years have the technology to deal with, but many of us can now make these real-time payments using a system called OSCO, if you want to check it out through your bank. Anyway, it doesn't change essentially the fact that the Reserve Bank, our central bank, stands between the federal government and the rest of us. And the deposit-taking institutions, why do you and I and Malcolm Turnbull and the government of Victoria and Kim's Cafe, wherever that is, why do we see our deposits with these banks as big money? because we can transfer funds to others, or most importantly, because in a sense this drives money, we can pay our taxes to the federal government via our bank's exchange settlement account balances. Broad measures of the money supply include currency, don't include exchange settlement account balances because they'd sort of be double counting if they did, but do include all of our deposits with the banking system. And banks' exchange settlement account balances are a very small proportion of our deposits with the bank, something like 2% at the moment. So there are different forms of money. At the top of our monetary system sits the Commonwealth or federal government. And I was just talking about the monetary base, the cash or currency we carry around with us, and the tiny amounts which our banks hold in exchange settlement account balances. In America, there are minimum ratios for cash balances that private banks have to hold at the central bank. There is no minimum in Australia except 0. They're not allowed to run overdrafts on their exchange settlement accounts, but they don't hold very much in their exchange settlement accounts. They hold a bit more than they used to because of the change I was talking about before, because of the change in our payments system in recent years, but they still don't hold very much. It's not very profitable to hold exchange settlement account balances. Go on.
Is that interest bearing?
It is. I might tell you about that in the next slide or two. But yes, currency doesn't pay interest, exchange settlement account balances do. Not a commercial rate of interest though, not a profitable rate of interest to receive. Down here we've got your bank's IOU to you. Now why do we accept that as money? Because our bank promises to use its exchange settlement account on our behalf to facilitate transactions for us. But private bank money is further down this monetary pyramid. And I wouldn't be in the monetary pyramid at all if we were talking about me giving you an IOU. But if you wanted to sort of extend it, I guess the rest of us would be down below the banking system. Our deposits with banks are particularly safe since the financial crisis, because if you've got up to $250,000 deposited with a bank, there is now a Commonwealth government guarantee as well, which means if the bank was to fail, you'd get the money back from the government. That didn't used to be the case. Government money, or central bank money, the monetary base, is sometimes called vertical money. It's passed down to the private sector from the government and the RBA. It is a net financial asset for the private sector. This is money we have, which isn't our debt. Most of the broad money supply, something like 95% of it, money you've got in your bank account, is in your bank account because somebody else in the private sector borrowed it into existence first. Money is created when banks lend, like I was saying before. If a bank makes a loan to you, sure, you owe the bank money, but the bank has put funds in your account. If you spend those funds and you give them to me and I save them, they'll be in my bank account. Did my saving provide the banking system with the cash for you to borrow? No, it's the other way around. You borrowed the money into existence and then I could save it. That's how the monetary system works. Anyway, that's called private money or credit money because it's created by banks lending, or sometimes horizontal money because it's passed across the private sector. You notice there's a difference here. Money that's created through private borrowing is, sure, money that's created now, but there's a debt that has to be serviced in the future. All money is a form of debt. Most debts don't count as money. Vertical money, government money, is, somebody called Randall Wray used this term, I'm not sure it's very elegant, that which is necessary to pay taxes. Twin tops. Horizontal money is accepted because it can be converted into that which is necessary to pay your taxes. In a sense, taxes drive money. When money was first introduced in pre-monetary societies, during colonial times, when colonial powers invaded a society which didn't use money previously, how did they get people to use money? Well, they didn't want people to use money. They wanted people to come and work on plantations or build infrastructure or work as servants or something How are you going to get them to do that without enslaving them? Well, you tax them. If they don't want to be locked in prison, they have to pay you taxes using money with Queen Victoria's head on. They haven't got any money with Queen Victoria's head on. How are they going to get that money? Well, they're going to have to come and work for you and earn it. So they'll come and they'll work on the plantation, or they'll build whatever you want them to build. Some of them won't do that. Some of them will provide services to other people to get the money. But you've introduced money into a society where there was no money before. That happened in country after country after country. These days, when we talk about taxes driving money, what we mean is that if we didn't have taxes and we did have a government that's spending, 25% of GDP, then over time the amount of money in circulation would go up and we'd end up creating inflation because we'd be spending well beyond the productive capacity of the economy, and then money would lose all value. So we tax now in order, if you like, to reduce private sector spending power, to create room within the productive capacity of the economy for the government to spend without creating inflation. That doesn't mean taxation and government spending have to equal each other, though, and normally they don't. Government bonds are not in the monetary base, but perhaps they should be. As I said, government bonds and exchange settlement reserves are quite similar in some ways. Zoltan asked me about whether exchange settlement account balances pay interest. Yes, they do. The RBA pay interest on exchange settlement account balances. So exchange settlement account balances, which are not thought of as government debt, are interest-bearing liabilities of the government or of its central bank. Treasury bonds, which are thought of as government debt, are interest-bearing liabilities of the government. There isn't that much difference between them. Treasury bonds are quite liquid too. Their prices don't change very quickly over time. The secondary market, you can sell them and get the cash back quite quickly. I'd rather think of government debt as being the net money supply. By net, what I mean is actually it's the net financial assets of everybody else. The net financial liabilities of the government are the net financial assets of everybody else. Well, this is the way our system works as far as the cash rate is concerned. As we know, the cash rate is currently 1.25%. Technically, that's a target that the Board of the Reserve Bank announces on the first Tuesday of every month. They've just, of course, cut it for the first time since 2016 to 1.25%. This is not, apart from one or two technical things I'm not going to talk about, this is not a rate of interest at which the RBA lends to the banks or pays the banks. The RBA pays the banks a lower rate of interest than this on their exchange settlement account balances. It pays them a 1% interest rate at the moment. It pays them in general, as it says here, 0.25% below the target cash rate on their exchange settlement accounts. A rate below a commercial rate. Banks can approach the Reserve Bank of Australia for overnight lending. If they do this, if the banks initiate this, then they don't do it very often these days. Basically, you'll only do it if you've stuffed up your liquidity management. If it's too late in the day to borrow on the money market and you're worried that your exchange settlement balance is getting close to zero, then you'll borrow overnight from the RBA. They'll charge you a punitive interest rate. That's the ceiling. The cash rate itself, that 1.25% figure, is a target that the Reserve Bank has for the rate of interest at which it wants to see the private banks lend to each other overnight or for 24 hours. And this is necessary, the way our system works at the moment, in order for the system just to continue to operate, because remember, there are millions of transactions taking place every day. So there are funds going out of the exchange settlement accounts of some banks and going in to the exchange settlement accounts of other banks. And in order to facilitate the system to work smoothly, the banks that are accumulating excess funds, well, they don't want to leave them getting a 1% interest rate. They'd rather lend them overnight for 1.25%. And the other banks that are running short, they don't want to have to go to the RBA and pay 1.5%. They rather borrow at that 1.25% cash rate figure at the moment. We've had this system for so long, it's so well understood in what is a relatively simple banking system, that actually when the RBA wants that cash rate at which the banks lend to each other overnight, that rate of interest which is the benchmark that other interest rates are set with reference to in our economy to change. The RBA doesn't have to do anything, really, very much, except just announce the change. Because the key issue that everybody's used to now is there's sort of there's always a 0.25% incentive to lend excess funds from your exchange settlement account balance overnight, whatever the target cash rate is. So if they reduce the cash rate to 1% in the next meeting, then the whole thing will shift down. There'll still be that 0.25% incentive. The RBA doesn't create money to reduce the rate of interest. The RBA does nothing at all except announce a change in the cash rate. That's all that happens. If there was too much cash in the system, why would there be too much cash in the system? If there was too much cash in the system as a result of the government spending more than it taxed, so running a deficit, remember every dollar the government spends increases the reserves of the banks. Every dollar the government taxes reduces the reserves of the banks. If the government spends more than it taxes and nothing else happens, then the supply of exchange settlement reserves to the banking system will go above the level that the banks target collectively. They'll have excess reserves. You'll end up with a situation then where there's hardly any banks that need to borrow overnight. All the banks have got excess exchange settlement reserves. And if there is any overnight lending, the rate of interest on it will be not the target rate of 1.25%, it would be close to the floor, maybe at the floor. No bank will lend to another bank at a rate of interest below this floor because that's the rate you get from the RBA itself. On the other hand, if there was a shortage of reserves, why would there be a shortage of reserves? Oh, I don't know, this could be the result of cash that the RBA put in the system temporarily in the past being unwound, having to be paid back by the banks. So the bank's exchange settlement reserves were falling. Or for that matter, it could be that the Treasury has made a big Treasury bond issue, which private sector investors have bought, and that's meant funds going out of private banks' exchange settlement account balances. The banks are all short of funds now. Hardly any banks have excess funds. Well, if there is a bank with excess funds to lend, it's going to lend them at almost the ceiling rate, because most of the banks now are going to have to go to the RBA on borrow overnight. If the Reserve Bank did not carefully manage the total supply of funds to the system day to day, and the demand for reserves varies from day to day, mainly because of transactions between the government and the private sector, but there are other reasons too, then the rate of interest on the overnight market, the cash rate, would not be equal to the RBA's target. It would yo-yo up and down between the floor and the ceiling. And the Reserve Bank doesn't want that to happen. So the Reserve Bank trades on the money market to make sure it hits the target cash rate. Basically, this is what can happen. If there are flows from the private sector to the Reserve Bank or the government, that can create a shortage of reserves. If the government was running a surplus and did nothing about it, all those taxes would destroy reserves in the banking system, for example. If there was a shortage of reserves, so that the total supply of exchange settlement account balances in the system was below what the banks wanted to hold, then you'd need to add those reserves back to the system if you were the RBA. Otherwise, the cash rate would rise above your target level. You'd lose control of the official interest rate. On the other hand, flows from the government or the RBA to the private sector will create additional reserves. If you leave too many reserves in the system, like I was saying before, there'll be basically nobody will need to borrow overnight. They'll all be stuffed full of cash. And as a consequence of that, you'll lose control of the cash rate. Again, if the RBA didn't pay interest on reserves, the cash rate would fall to zero. Since it does, the cash rate would fall to the bottom, to the floor, to the rate the RBA pays. So the RBA tries to put additional funds into the system when there would otherwise be a shortage every day. As I'm going to explain in a moment before we finish, that's the case most days. The RBA deliberately keeps the banking system a little bit short of cash. When I say a little bit short, they alleviate that shortage every day, but they engineer it so the shortage will come round again in a few days' time and they can alleviate it again. That's what happens. Just put some more cash into the system, stop the cash rate from rising. Stop there being a shortage of funds. If there's a surplus of cash in the system, they need to do the opposite. Either the RBA or the government somehow needs to take the cash out of the system, or the cash rate would fall below the RBA's target. I just thought I'd tell you what happened a couple of days ago, because this happens every day. I didn't tell you what happened on Friday. I'm sorry, because I put these slides together a day or two ago. The Reserve Bank of Australia has most days kept the banks short of electronic cash and topped things up. They don't do this usually the way that first-year economics textbooks tell you they do it. They don't buy many treasury bonds outright anymore. Instead, they mainly do it through Reserve Bank of Australia initiated short-term secured loans. They're called reverse repos. Repo means sale and repurchase. Do you have cash converters here? Yeah?
Oh, sorry, South Australia.
Yeah, in South Australia we do. I know we do in South Australia. Pawn shops. I don't mean pornography, you know what I mean? Pawn shops. You can go to a pawn shop and you can sell them your watch and say, I'm going to buy the watch back from you in a week's time. Will you be paying a lower price or a higher price? Higher price. The gap between the two prices will give you an interest rate on that loan. The Reserve Bank of Australia is a pawn shop. They accept, sure, Commonwealth government securities, treasury bonds and treasury notes. They also accept a wide variety of high-class private sector securities too. You can go on their website and find out about it. Basically what happens most mornings, the Reserve Bank, first thing in the morning, 9:20 Melbourne time, they'll say, we expect there to be a, I don't know, $1,000 million cash shortage today. We're going to put $1,000 million into the system for, let's say, 19 days. They've got their own reasons for saying that. And they announce this through Reuters and Bloomberg, because you have to do stuff through the private sector these days. It's the law. It's not really the law, but that's the way they do it. And they say, OK, all you members of the Reserve Bank Information Transfer System, which basically means the banks and a few others, bid for the business. What you're really doing is you're bidding for the right to borrow cash for 19 days from the Reserve Bank of Australia. Everybody will bid for it, because if nobody else bid for it, you'd be able to borrow the cash really cheaply. That would reduce your funding costs a bit and you'd make a profit. So everybody puts in a bid. And the Reserve Bank lends the cash to those private banks that offer it the highest interest rate. But for legal reasons, what actually happens is the Reserve Bank buys those securities, including treasury bonds, from the private banks now, and at the same time agrees to resell them in 19 days' time, just like you with your watch at the pawn shop. It's called a reverse repo because the RBA isn't doing a sale and repurchase, it's doing a purchase and resale, if you see what I mean, when they put the cash into the system. That's how it works. This happens every day. On the 20th of June, this week, 9:20 a.m, they said they wanted to put this amount into the system for 19 days, and that's what happened. They don't care which bank they lend to, because then the banks can lend to each other on the overnight market at the cash rate and sort things out day to day. They're just trying to get the total amount in the system right. Why did they feed that cash into the system? Well, mainly because they previously fed about that amount of cash into the system a few weeks before, and it was going back out again, so they were replacing it once more. On the 13th of June, they didn't just do this. They do sometimes buy some treasury bonds outright. So that's why I included the 13th of June. That's the last time the RBA bought any treasury bonds outright. That puts cash into the system until those treasury bonds mature. On the 7th of June, they overdid it a bit. They don't always get things exactly right. And they talk to the banks, and after all, although we've got 100 authorised deposit-taking institutions, but there's only 4 of them that are important. So sort of imagine it's not the way to do it now, but they're on the phone to the big 4 banks. And of course, they know what's happening between the Treasury, the government and the private sector too. But at 9:20 on the 7th of June, they put about $4 billion. Sorry, it wasn't $4,150, it was $1,150 million into the system for 19 days again. It's not always 19 days, it's just coincidence. But they sometimes, at 5:10 in the afternoon, have another round, in case they haven't got it quite right. And what happened on the 7th of June was that they worked out later in the day, oh, we put a bit too much cash into the system. If we don't do something about this, there'll be a surplus cash, and the cash rate will fall below our target. So we'll take it out again. This is a straight repo. What do I mean by that? Later on in the day, the Reserve Bank said, we don't want to lend more to you. We kind of want to borrow it back again. Only for 5 days. Don't ask me why it was for 5 days. Borrowing it back again, well, that means the Reserve Bank selling some securities from its balance sheet to the private banks and agreeing to repurchase them in a few days' time. It's just fine-tuned the amount of cash in the system. It's ridiculous, isn't it? It's so complicated. It doesn't need to be this complicated. But basically what's happening is day to day, the demand for reserves from the banks in their exchange settlement accounts goes up and down for a variety of reasons, including what they expect the government to do soon. And the RBA has to meet it. The RBA isn't choosing how much to put into the system every day in order to do anything other than to meet the demands of the banking system with cash. When there are surplus funds in the system, this is important. Why does the government issue treasury bonds in Australia? In order to more or less exactly match the gap between government spending and taxation. When we moved to the current system in 1982, the Reserve Bank told us, and you can still find this on the RBA website if you look carefully enough, they did it to help the RBA manage interest rates. Until the 1970s, interest rates in Australia were highly regulated, were not set through the market, basically. Banks didn't pay interest on deposits anyway, not transaction deposits, and interest rates on loans were highly regulated. At the end of the 1970s, Australia moved to a more market-based system, and the Reserve Bank then basically had to do what they do now, really, which is to manage the supply of cash to the private banks to try and ensure that the cash rate stayed at the RBA's target level. But a problem that they had was that until this point in time, it was commonly the case that the government would spend more than it raised in taxes, but then wouldn't sell enough treasury bonds to the private sector to absorb the extra cash that had been created, because they just sold whatever treasury bonds investors were prepared to buy at interest rates, or yields, that's the word they use for it, that the RBA chose for the government. So if there wasn't enough demand from the private sector for treasury bonds, they just didn't sell any. It was called the TAP system. The RBA bought them. That doesn't happen anymore. They stopped doing this. Not that it's illegal, they just stopped doing it in 1982. The reason why they stopped doing it was because when those bonds were not sold, what happened was the reserves stayed in the system. So you created a surplus of reserves, and the RBA would have needed to engage itself in a very high level of transactions in order to keep control of interest rates. So to help the Reserve Bank manage interest rates by managing the supply of cash to the banking system in 1982, they introduced the auctioning of long-term treasury bonds and short-term treasury notes by the government in whatever amount was necessary to stop government spending creating excess reserves in the banking system. That's why they did it. Not because they need to borrow the money, in other words. In order to obscure things even more, to make it look as though the government needs to borrow money, in 1999 the RBA stopped being responsible for doing this at all, and the Australian Office of Financial Management, which is part of the Treasury, now deals with the issuance of new government securities. But of course, it has a big impact on flows of funds into and out of private bank exchange settlement accounts. So they have to coordinate this very carefully with the Reserve Bank if the Reserve Bank is going to keep control of the supply of cash to the banking system. It's not independent of what's happening in government. Anyway, how's all this worked? Well, the current system in all its detail came in 1993. That's when the RBA was given the job of actually determining what the cash rate should be. And when they started, they didn't always get it exactly right. So that the actual cash rate, which is the average interest rate on overnight interbank loans, which is collected from the banks by the Reserve Bank, was not always precisely equal to the RBA's target. That's what those black blobs are about. They were trying to get it right, but they didn't get it exactly right early on. As you move into the 2000s, what do you notice about the black blobs? They disappear. We've got more finely defined detail over here because a basis point is 1/100th of 1%. So the scale is different. But even here, you can see during the 2000s, since the financial crisis, basically the overnight cash rate the private banks use has barely ever been 1/100th of 1% away from the RBA's target. So the RBA announces the target cash rate of 1.25%, and that is the rate of interest at which the private banks lend to and borrow from each other. They've come to understand the system. The RBA has come to be very good at managing the supply of cash to the system. And when they reduced the target cash rate, which they did at the last meeting, what happens? Nothing happens as far as the RBA is concerned. A lot of people that go to economics classes get taught some nonsense about the Reserve Bank buying government bonds to feed more cash into the system to reduce the interest rate. Utter nonsense, as the Reserve Bank will tell you. They do tell you. They don't do anything, they just announce it. That's all that happens. The whole corridor comes down, and that 0.25% incentive to lend on the overnight cash market, that's still there. Nothing else changes. Now, they're talking about zero interest rates, and when they get to zero interest rates, they'll talk about quantitative easing. What does quantitative easing involve? If we were in Australia to introduce quantitative easing, which we have never done yet, unlike central banks in almost every other high-income country in the world, it would mean the RBA no longer trying to manage the supply of cash to the banking system to hit a target for the overnight interbank lending rate anymore. It would mean the RBA deliberately making the overnight market irrelevant. They would make the overnight market irrelevant by engaging in very large-scale outright purchases of government bonds and perhaps some private sector securities as well to flood the banking system with reserves. It wouldn't be free money, it would be an asset swap to the extent that the RBA was buying government bonds the private banks owned, well, not just the private banks, the private investors owned, from the private sector, and was paying for those government bonds by creating additional exchange settlement reserves, then, like I've just said, government bonds are an interest-bearing liability of the government. Exchange settlement accounts at the RBA are an interest-bearing liability of the government. You are swapping two virtually identical assets. It's not free money. You'd be buying government bonds. What it would do, though, and what it has done in a lot of countries, it would make the ceiling redundant. So in Europe, the only banks that borrow at the ceiling rate from the European Central Bank are basically the Greek banks that are desperate. The overnight market doesn't exist because the European Central Bank keep putting more and more and more reserves into the system, so that the level of reserves the private banks need, oh, what's happened here? Lost my, is far less than the reserves that they've created. What does that do? It reduces the official interest rate to the floor rate. So the official interest rate in the UK now is the bank rate. The bank rate is the rate of interest the Bank of England pays on bank reserve balances. It used to be a rate called SONIA, which was the overnight interest rate between the banks. Banks don't lend to each other overnight in the UK. There's all those excess reserves. They don't need to. All quantitative easing does is it reduces the official interest rate to the floor rate. If you make the floor rate zero, then the official interest rate will be zero. What do you know about official interest rates in Japan and in the Eurozone? Do you know what they are? They're negative. The official interest rate in Japan is minus 0.1%, and the official interest rate for the European Central Bank is minus 0.4%. How is that possible? Well, you do quantitative easing, you flood the banking system with reserves, and then not only do you not pay a positive interest rate on those reserves, you charge an interest rate on them. You effectively tax some of those reserves back out of the system. Again, why would you do that? You're trying to get the banks desperate to get rid of the reserves. They can't lend the reserves to members of the public. A bank can't lend its reserves to you. You haven't got a reserve account. Just like you can't pay money from your bank account to somebody else without withdrawing it in cash if they don't have a bank account. So a bank cannot lend its exchange settlement reserves to you because you don't have an exchange settlement account. What they can try and do is get rid of them like hot potatoes. If they could do enough lending, then the people that they were borrowing to would spend from their deposits, and that would transfer balances to other banks, and then the other banks would be stuck with those reserves with a negative interest rate. That's the idea. It's lunacy, of course it is. It doesn't even work, really. The banks are not foolish enough to take on ridiculous risks like that when they've already got very weak balance sheets, and their regulators wouldn't let them anyway, but that's the idea. Okay. Why does the Reserve Bank manage interest rates the way it does? You know, the cash rate, as I said, is a key reference rate for our economy as a whole. If you've got a fixed rate mortgage, then there are a variety of influences on the interest rate you'll pay, but the main influence is what your lending institution expects to happen to the cash rate on average during the period of time when your mortgage rate is fixed. Interest rates to a greater or lesser extent in Australia are linked to the cash rate, which after all is the marginal cost of cash to a bank which is short of cash and has to borrow overnight on the money market. Why would you cut interest rates like they were doing until 2016? They've cut them again now. Because the Reserve Bank has a target for CPI inflation where they're supposed to try and keep the inflation rate within a 2 to 3% range on average over the next 2 years. They have completely failed to do this for about 4 years now. Inflation has continuously undershot the Reserve Bank's target. The economy has not grown as quickly as the government would have liked. Inflation has not been as strong. You must know wages have not been rising. Labour costs have not been rising as quickly as they'd expected. Unemployment is low, but underemployment isn't, as we know. Anyway. Cutting interest rates isn't going to help much. We have all that household debt. And the other reason why it's not going to help much is that, of course, when you cut interest rates, if you've got a mortgage, sure, it means you've got more disposable income. But I've got term deposits. What's it doing to me? There are losers as well as gainers. And if the gainers outweigh the losers, it's not by that much. And on top of that, we've got to a point now where interest rate cuts and talks of zero interest rates and possible quantitative easing are perceived by many people as just a signal that the Reserve Bank is panicking and the economy is actually in a much worse state than they're telling everybody. So you then get that signal, that information, which is counterproductive. You cut interest rates and it doesn't necessarily push the economy forward, it can pull it back. Even if you did push it forward, that sugar hit, if it means households going and borrowing even more, is going to give you an even bigger hangover in the future. So monetary policy is always unreliable, and with the level of household debt we have in Australia at the moment, in my opinion, is basically bust. The Reserve Bank has an inflation target. It has no way of hitting this inflation target. It's relying on external factors.
Philip Lowe thinks that too.
Well, yeah. And, well, indeed, he believes that the government should be doing more, but he often contradicts himself. I had an article in Independent Australia earlier this year where Philip Lowe was saying, at that time, the government needs to pay down its debt. It's important that the government runs a surplus. He's now completely contradicting what he was saying 6 months ago. If he's saying now the government needs to run a bigger deficit.
Has he discovered MMT perhaps?
Well, maybe. I think he's aware of it, but what he thinks of it, I don't know. Fiscal policy works, monetary policy doesn't. Central bankers think they're managing the economy. Warren Mosler says they're like a child sitting next to the driver in the passenger seat with a toy steering wheel. They imagine that they're steering the car. It's the government budget. that's steering the car, it's fiscal flows that are steering the car, because they change what I've been calling the net money supply, or the supply of net financial assets to the private sector. Fiscal policy works. Fiscal policy is a job of the government. It's not something the Reserve Bank is allowed to do legally. The Reserve Bank is not supposed to give away money to the private sector. It can lend to certain institutions. It can trade in certain financial assets. It can't engage in it's not supposed to be able to engage in government purchases and taxation. That's the job of the government, which has to pass a budget through Parliament. The trouble is our government, and unfortunately the opposition, thinks it has to pay down the debt, which means, imagine, well, you don't need to imagine, maybe you're like me. When they talk about running a surplus, I just mentally change that to destroying money. That's what they're doing. A fiscal surplus involves destroying money. It doesn't add to the ability of the government to spend in the future, because the government has a limitless ability to spend. It's the inflation constraint which limits our ability to spend as a whole country without destroying confidence in money. So, why issue debt at all? Why issue treasury bonds at all? To pay for things? No. You are borrowing back your own currency that you created. You do not need to issue government debt to pay for things. The Bank of Japan in the last couple of years has been buying Japanese government debt quicker than the Japanese government's been issuing it. And the Bank of Japan is effectively owned by the Japanese government and controlled by the Japanese government. The supply of Japanese government bonds in Japan, which is the high-income country with the biggest fiscal deficit at the moment, has been shrinking over time, because as soon as the government issues them, they have the same rule in Japan as in other countries, ridiculously, that the central bank's not supposed to buy significant amounts of government debt directly from the government. They buy it second-hand. They may as well buy it from the government. To help the RBA hit the target for the cash rate, there's no need to do that if we, just bearing in mind what we were talking about from quantitative easing, if you just let reserves in the banking system increase, the official interest rate will just change to whatever rate the RBA pays on bank balances. To provide safe assets to savers, allow everybody to hold term deposits at the RBA. Much simpler. Not just the fund managers either. There's no reason why you or I couldn't do it. Allow us all to have term deposits with the RBA. If you want to control the whole term structure of interest rates, that would do it. You destroy a few jobs in a few banks, but they're not doing anything useful anyway. Because there was once a reason. Yeah, actually there was. Gold standard days, fixed exchange rate days. There did used to be a good reason for issuing government bonds, which I won't worry about now, but there hasn't been for 35 years. I think this is just one of those things we do because we always have. What if we stopped issuing government debt? Fiscal deficits would just add to the net money supply like they do now, but you'd be leaving additional reserves in the banking system. The official interest rate would be the floor rate, just like it is under quantitative easing. You wouldn't be issuing government securities at all. It changes nothing much, but nobody would ever imagine the government was going to run out of money again. The issue would then be, how do you balance the economy? You don't want to spend too much. You don't want too big a fiscal deficit. It will create inflation. There's no reason to get rid of that 2 to 3% inflation target. You should keep something like that. Redefine the cash rate as the rate paid by the RBA on exchange settlement account balances. Set that rate low, or maybe, Bill Mitchell would say, set it at 0 and leave it there. It doesn't mean you get to borrow at 0 interest rate from your bank. You're risky. There'd be a risk premium. Continue to spend by keystrokes like you do now, but just leave the additional reserves in the system. Offer everybody the opportunity to hold term deposits at a government bank. You could call it the Reserve Bank of Australia, if you like. Stop talking about the national debt. It isn't the debt of the nation anyway, and the government doesn't have debt in a meaningful sense. Not the Commonwealth government. Not that they've got to repay ever. Start talking about the net money supply instead, and then start talking about what it would mean to balance the economy rather than the budget. Okay, well, I've gone on quite a long time, but That's it, really.
I really enjoyed the talk. It's really fascinating. Do you know of any countries around the world where, well, you seem to say that the discourse is really important to get that message across, and in Australia it appears that the Labor and Liberal Party are both running the same line, which, do you think members of Parliament here are aware of this and they're lying about it, or they're appeasing the voters, or do you think they're being misinformed?
They're not all lying about it. Most of them are not talking about it at all. Most of them have, including one or two people that I quite like and get on with, quite a lot of members of Parliament are not interested in macroeconomics, and they're interested in other things, which is fine, not naming any names. There are a few that are interested in modern monetary theory. There are, in both the Greens and the Australian Labor Party, they're not in the majority at the moment, far from it. I think there is a better chance, despite what you see in the media at the moment, of the new leadership of the ALP being interested in these issues than there was the old. So I think I see some positive signs there. Bill is talking to some people. There are some other people that I can't even talk about who are talking to people in Canberra. I've done a talk in Canberra myself. I can't tell you who that was to. This is not to big up modern monetary theory. It's just to point out when people are very negative about these things, they shouldn't be. 10 years ago, there were, I don't know, 5 or 10 people in Australia talking about these issues. There are now thousands of people. It is definitely the case that the Australian Greens and the Australian Labor Party are both actively thinking about a federal job guarantee now, which was not the case before. And as far as moving towards functional finance, which is an old-fashioned term for what I was just talking about, is concerned, that's going to change quite quickly, because I think the current orthodoxy is going to fail very badly over the next couple of years. So I'm quite hopeful.
So with your suggesting shifting term deposits for some federal treasuries, what sort of resistance would there be from the bond market that
Who cares?
speculating?
I've scrapped the bond market.
What influence would they have to sort of spread misinformation and try to fight it? Is it
Well, if I'm elected Prime Minister, none at all. What risk would there be? Potentially, if you upset these people, it's not that they'd sell government bonds, because you don't really care about that anyway. They might sell the Australian dollar, which would put some downward pressure on the currency. But, you know, they'll do that if there's a vaguely radical Labor government anyway. So I don't think this makes things any more difficult as far as that's concerned. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, because I used to train people that traded on the foreign exchange market, and they're looking to make a profit. They're not particularly ideological. So I think that concern is overblown. The Australian dollar has been depreciating much of the time for the last year and a half. We have quite a flexible economy the way it's set up now. It doesn't create severe inflationary pressures. Indeed, while our currency's been, in a limited way, collapsing on the foreign exchange market for the last year and a half, the RBA has continued to miss its inflation target on the low side. So a lot of the fears people have are misplaced. You don't need to get rid of Treasury bonds. If you could persuade people that Treasury bonds ought not to be thought of in the same way that you think of corporate bonds. It's just, if that's difficult, then change the institution. Get rid of Treasury bonds altogether. There's no absolute need to have them. We don't have a gold standard. We don't need the government to sell them like the Bank of England was selling government bonds at the end of the 17th century to raise gold reserves. That's not the monetary system we have anymore. I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow. Go on.
Can you name any countries around the world where the discourse is a lot better with modern monetary theory?
Well, there are some interesting things happening. There have been a lot of quite vociferous debates between policymakers, politicians and senior public servants in Japan recently, because the Japanese government and its central bank continues to, publicly they say things like, because I think they don't know anything about modern monetary theory, so the Japanese Prime Minister has said to use modern monetary theory would be to engage in a dangerous experiment. We won't be doing dangerous experiments in Japan. They've been net spending with 0% interest rates on government debt because the central bank's been buying the government bonds for years now. They are the poster child of modern monetary theory in many ways. They're just not aware that they've been doing it because they don't know what modern monetary theory is. Every now and then they create a mini slump in Japan by ill-advisedly raising a tax, a sales tax, in order to try and push the government budget balance back towards zero. But then the economy crashes and their tax receipts in general fail, and so the fiscal deficit goes up again, and they stop doing that. But Japan, there's an interesting discourse in Japan. In the US, Bernie's chief economic advisor is Stephanie Kelton, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is going around everywhere flashing Bill's textbook at the moment. So these things are being discussed. There are members of parliament in the Labour Party in the UK that are fully on board with MMT. It's just, unfortunately, that the advisors of the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer are not at the moment. Bill is really world famous now.
And Jan's very obvious as well.
Yeah, well, he's a friend of all these people. And his chief economic advisor was James Galbraith. James is a modern money theorist. He doesn't necessarily describe himself as such because he's from the previous generation. But you'll find loads of YouTube talks he's given, some of which I was in the room for, where he said basically modern monetary theory is just macroeconomics done correctly.
Just a general point, just before, but say somebody showed us that we had to close down the fossil industry in 10 years, that's it, say somebody proves that. That would be an amazing thing for modern monetary theory, wouldn't it? Because we'd simply compensate the fossil industry, pay them all, retire them, pension them off, and transfer the assets across to massive solar farms all over the world's deserts, and then that would free energy.
What it does is it concentrates your thinking, because the problem when dealing with climate change is about real resources and ecological resources. It's not about money. So whatever it is technically possible to do, you can pay for. If you spend too much, you'll create inflationary pressures, but it is never a reason not to do something which is a good idea, because...
But given that point I made, 10 years, that's it, you've cooked the planet, then that would force the issue, that's what I'm saying.
Well, one of the things I want to do in our conference in January is to have people who are not just economists speaking, because we want to talk about a just transition and a Green New Deal. And I think a problem in the recent election was that, whether this is true or not, some people in Queensland perceived that you were taking away their jobs, or you were threatening them with a loss of income and jobs, and not offering them anything in return. So it was a very negative, almost confrontational approach to dealing with people. And what we'd like to say is, really, we can't afford you to be, not that coal mines employ many people anyway, but we can't afford you to be doing this coal mine, and we've got more important things for you to do. This is what we'd like to talk to you about doing instead. That's got to be part of a Green New Deal. You then have to worry about whether the technology exists, whether the natural resources you need exist, whether it will work, whether you've got the skills in place, how much you'll have to spend, what will then happen as a result of that expenditure, what demands will that create for real resources, will that be inflationary? If it might be inflationary, what are you going to do about it? In the Second World War, in the UK, Keynes introduced a form of compulsory savings. In other words, that in wartime, the British government did not say, we can't fight Hitler because we've run out of money, even though there'd just been the Great Depression mass unemployment, poverty, malnutrition, starvation marches, all the rest of it. The British government was convinced that it was bankrupt in the 1930s. Suddenly the 1940s came around, there was the Second World War, they weren't bankrupt anymore. Of course, the government just spent as it needed to in order to prosecute the war effort. And in terms of avoiding that being inflationary, I'm not suggesting rationing now, but they used rationing to an extent. Something else they did was they had compulsory saving, basically locked up some of people's ability to spend until after the war. Again, I'm not suggesting doing that now, but we have had much, or countries have had much greater challenges to deal with, in some respects anyway, in the past. And when they've dealt with them, it's been about managing real resources and dealing with inflation risk. It's never been about whether you're going to run out of bits of paper, or these days, numbers on a spreadsheet. That's what money is. Money is not the main issue. That's the point. Go on.
I think about a week or two ago, the Italian government threatened to issue a type of treasury that would be able to use to pay tax. And what do you think is the sort of what's coming for the euro? What's the sort of path going forward? Do you think it has a...
I think it might have been used as a bargaining ploy. That's actually what they've done, is they've taken Warren Mosler's idea. I should have mentioned that, shouldn't I, when you asked whether any governments anywhere... Unfortunately, the governments that seem to be not scared to use a modern monetary theory frame, even if they don't say it's modern monetary theory, to discuss macroeconomics at the moment, are governments on the right. There's nothing particularly left-wing about modern monetary theory. It's just understanding how the monetary system works. So if Donald Trump wants to give people tax cuts last year, and when Democrats complain about that, turn around and say, well, we're not going to run out of dollars. And I deplore almost everything Donald Trump ever says or does. But I couldn't help but laugh when the Democrats were laughing at Donald Trump when he said that, because I was thinking, well, he's absolutely right. He's not wrong. That's the one thing he said, which is actually absolutely right. He's not going to run out of dollars. And of course, I mean, they've got their problems now, but the main reason why the US economy has done better than the Australian economy, in some respects, in the last year and a half, has been the deficit spending. Not a very effective way of doing it. You give tax cuts to rich people, they don't spend very much of the tax cuts anyway. But as far as the Italian government is concerned, I think if they go ahead with those tax anticipation notes, that's what they are. When you introduce a currency, if you make people pay their taxes in that currency, it creates a demand for that currency. The Italian government is saying we won't break the rules of the euro or leave the euro, but instead what we'll do is we'll issue some zero interest bearing tax anticipation notes, again, as Bill will tell you if you ask him, in order to start buying government bonds, and then later on say, if necessary, we will buy limitless amounts of them to stop interest rates on government bonds rising, to stop any of the Eurozone governments defaulting. But this was contingent on the governments whose bonds they were buying fulfilling a set of criteria that Greece, for example, didn't, and Italy has been in and out of over time. That's the issue, really.
Another question, Steve. Thank you very, very much. You're a 25-year veteran. You certainly know your stuff on this side of things. I could see from when you began talking about MMT, you were relaxed, sitting on the bench there. The moment we got onto banking, you were off and strutting this stuff. So thank you.
I'm amazed that anybody would want to come and listen on a Sunday afternoon to somebody talking about exchange settlement account balances and treasury bonds. But thank you very much. I hope it wasn't very boring.
Thank you very much for sharing that knowledge.
Hi, welcome back. I'm Jeff Kelton, your host. So what did you think? What did you think about what you just saw? Stephen Hale talking initially about MMT as a brief primer and then talking about the banking system. Let us know. One of my biggest takeaways, and I still, talk about this all the time, what does it mean for a monetary sovereign, a country that makes its own currency, issues its own currency, issues taxes and collects debts in that currency, does not promise to convert that currency into anything else, and is not on a currency peg. Anything that is physically possible is financially affordable under those conditions. And that is true for any country. If you are a developing country, what is possible is going to be very different from a fully developed economy like the United States. So other countries, that have foreign denominated debt, it's going to be a lot harder for them to achieve real prosperity, but it's not impossible. But if you understand the monetary system, you now have a set of principles and policy proposals in front of you that can help you get to a position where you can actually start seeing real prosperity. So it's not just US-centric. It's not just developed country-centric. MMT is simply a description of currency, and under that lens, any country that issues its own currency can begin the long process of achieving full financial sovereignty and achieving prosperity. So it makes you understand, what does it mean for a monetary sovereign to have a balanced budget? What does it mean for a monetary sovereign to have a fiscal deficit? What does it mean for a monetary sovereign to have a fiscal surplus? You have to understand the monetary system to understand which one is good and which one is bad. And when you understand that, you also understand that it's not the same answer. You have to look to the real economy, what's really going on. So I hope this gives you a lot of information. I hope you have questions. If you do, let us know. Send us an email, make a comment. Let us know if you have any questions. We'll be back next week.